Welcome back. I'm Philip Mena. A trio of filings in the Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort cases have shaken things up in the Russia investigation. But what is actually in the memos, and how does it affect President Trump and those in his inner circle? Our legal experts are here to break it all down for us. Danny Cevallos, MSNBC legal analyst, Katie Phang, attorney, and MSNBC legal contributor Glenn Kirschner, former federal prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst, and Cynthia Alksne, former federal prosecutor.
Thank you, Philip. We're going to try and break down these government filings as the plot thinnens. So the first question before us is, did the president violate campaign finance laws? You know, this week, according to the Southern District of New York, Michael Cohen acted with the intent to influence the 2016 presidential election. I'm reading from the filing. In particular, and as Cohen himself has now admitted, with respect to both payments, he acted in coordination with and at the direction of individual one, the then candidate Donald Trump. For the first time, the government's stated theory of the case was that a crime was committed and Donald Trump directed it and coordinated it.
Right.
But Cynthia Alksne, I have to ask you, is that enough? The crime of campaign finance law violation requires a knowing and willful violation. What do you say to my proposed defense that the president is not guilty by reason of galactic ignorance?
which is probably true, the galactic ignorance part. Here's what we've got. They have evidence of the meeting with Pecker where they agreed to buy these. He's got motive. We have a tape. We have documents to support the legal aspect. We have the financial records. We have lying about it afterwards, which is consciousness of guilt evidence. And when you add that all up, and still we don't know about other corroborating evidence, but we know that much already. Yes, the president is guilty of campaign finance violence.
You really think it rises to the level of knowingly and willingly violates campaign finance law? We know there's a history between Donald Trump and his fixer, Michael Cohen, to be able to make these kinds of payments. And we know that Donald Trump has said, and Cohen said himself before he found God and decided to tell the truth, that he did this kind of stuff because he wanted to protect the brand and the personal reputation of Donald Trump. So is that enough necessarily, Glenn, do you think, to be able to get some type of conviction of somebody like Donald Trump?
You know, Katie, as a former federal career prosecutor, this is going to surprise you. I think it's enough. Here's the thing. If I were arguing this to a jury, I would say, ladies and gentlemen, you've got a tape in which Donald Trump is heard being complicit in a scheme to pay off a porn star and a Playboy playmate. You've got, as Cynthia mentioned, you've got a sham corporation being set up as a pass-through for the payments. And you've got Michael Cohen walking into federal court, raising his right hand, being sworn, and looking a federal judge in the eye and saying, I did this to impact the election at the direction and with the coordination of then candidate Donald Trump. And I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, they tried to steal your vote from you. Don't let them get away with it.
But Glenn, what if someone counters, hey, I was trying to hide this because of my marriage. I wanted to keep this private. My shenanigans are not for public consumption. It didn't have anything to do with benefiting my campaign. Is that a viable defense?
I think it is a defense. I don't think it's a viable defense. And if jurors want to believe that, then I have a candidate to sell them.
And there's the timing, too. Remember, the last one happened right before the election.
That's right,
and
October 2016.
Right, and
right
the threats
before.
are right before the election, and by then the polls are starting to close a little bit. Everybody's getting a little nervous. Nobody knows what's going on. Like, oh my goodness, this guy could actually win. And that's when the pressure goes on from from Stormy Daniels. And they pay her off.
But you really only have, though, right now, Michael Cohen. So what other evidence are we looking at in terms of what the Southern District of New York would have if they wanted to go after Donald Trump? Glenn, you mentioned that there was audio. Can we tee up some of that audio to be able to listen to exactly what the conversation was between Donald Trump and Michael Cohen?
When it comes time for the financing, which will be... What financing? We'll have to pay yourself. No. I got... No.
So, Glenn, is that the audio that you're talking about that directly implicates Donald Trump in campaign finance violations?
That is the audio. But, you know, there is no one piece of evidence that ever proves the case. You don't just introduce a tape and say, ladies and gentlemen, we rest our case, the tape proves it all. You introduce the testimony, you introduce electronic communications, emails, texts, you introduce, obviously, the sham court.
All the stuff on those search warrants,
And,
right?
and you know what? You put a lot of meat on the bones, and I believe any reasonable juror would believe that, you know what, Trump was in this to win it. And I think even during that recording, they were talking about things like poll numbers. So I think we all know what's going on there.
Is it required that Donald Trump knew he was violating this election law, as opposed to knowing that what he was doing was secret, was something he had to keep from other people? I mean, isn't that the requirement? Isn't that the burden the government has to meet?
He has to know he's violating the election laws, but the fact that he was lying about it for so long, and the timing and everything else, I think the government will make that. But let's just say we make it. Let's say, okay, we got it. Now what do? The Southern District of New York is in a position where they have two co-conspirators. One of them has pled guilty. The other one is the top guy. And there's this memo from the Department of Justice that says can you indict the president? It's an odd situation where you don't have where you have evidence about somebody, the conspiracy, and you can't indict him. Are you just going to leave that?
So, Cynthia, that's a great question, because if there's enough proof that a presidential candidate committed any number of felonies to try to steal the election, it seems to me pretty incongruous for that president, once sworn into office, then to hold up as a shield, I'm the president, so you can do nothing about it in the courts until I leave the presidency.
But you're bringing up a great point. Who's now on the Supreme Court of the United States? We have Brett Kavanaugh, and it is no secret that as far back as 2009, Justice Kavanaugh was saying that a sitting president of the United States should not be either sued civilly or criminally prosecuted for his or her acts. So does that necessarily mean that we may have a challenge going all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States on something like this?
But if someone wanted to prosecute Trump, they might not even have to deal with the Supreme Court. Most federal crimes, let's say a statute of limitations of 5 years. But with conspiracy, that clock starts running from the last day of the act that furthered that conspiracy. So, 4-year terms, if President Trump were voted out of office in the next round, you could say the latest date of that conspiracy happened today, tomorrow, something else that gets them past that date.
What about this kind of a compromise position? I've been thinking about this. So the Justice Department memo is you can't indict the sitting president. Okay, it's just a memo, right? And there are ways around memos, okay? When you look at all the arguments from the framers to these memos, they're always about how is anybody going to run the country? So, and I think that makes sense.
Oh,
right?
How do you put Matthew Whitaker?
How can you run the country if you're under indictment? Okay, I think that makes sense. But you could indict somebody and seal it until after they're not in office anymore, and then you wouldn't have trouble with statute of limitations. It's a good compromise position. Nobody could hold up the shield and steal an election and never be prosecuted.
That doesn't have to be the whole purpose, though. I mean, if he stole the election, and that's what Glenn was saying, then why do you let him write out an entire term of 4 years before you prosecute him, Glenn?
Right. Following up on both Cynthia and Katie's point, when it comes to the Constitution of the Supreme Court, I think we need to look directly at what Kavanaugh said. Kavanaugh said Congress should pass a law protecting the president against prosecution. If Justice Kavanaugh is being intellectually honest, that means he has concluded the Constitution doesn't protect the president against the prosecution, or you wouldn't need Congress to act. So we have to keep that in mind.
Plus now we have Barr. What do you think about that?
I think that's probably a good choice compared to some of Trump's other choices, but I don't